All right, welcome to episode 55 of the SumerSports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm joined not by Thomas Dimitrov, but by Parker Fleming, one of our extraordinary data scientists at SumerSports. If you are a fan of this podcast, you have listened to Parker host the show on a number of occasions, but today we're hosting it together. Parker, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. Win totals are out for college. I've been doing some G5 research this weekend. It's been a lot of fun to look into it. So it's a good time of year. Football's getting closer every day, man.
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to talk to you about college football today. Because look, my normal co-host Thomas Dimitrov is not a bettor. He's not a fantasy player. And you are though, and you're somebody whose opinion I value tremendously on this. You also, came to SumerSports from a very different background than me, as far as you were building a lot of this yourself. And then I of course, for those that don't know, I was building some of the the betting and then some of the fantasy tools at PFF. And so I approach things from my perspective, and I always sort of look whenever you are handicapping, gambling, playing fantasy football, whatever. You do have to have like a Rolodex of people that you trust, or that you respect, or trust and respect, that you look at their numbers to make sure that you're sort of on the right page, right? And so, for those who are listening to the show, what we're going to do today is sort of go over kind of all of the things that go into modeling college football, and from a betting and fantasy, and also just like an overall enjoyment perspective. And the first thing I want to ask you, Parker, how did you get into college football, and how did you get into college? Because honestly, like, obviously this is where, sort of on Twitter and stuff, you kind of made a name for yourself. Like, when did you get into like college football, and then college football gaming specifically?
Yeah. Been a fan, obviously, my entire life. But like kind of in that, posts in my like first couple of grad classes, I didn't have a lot of math undergrad. So I took like 7 or 8 math classes over the course of 2 or 3 semesters to make up and get enough credit so that I could continue grad school. And being bored in those classes was like, how do I stay sane? How do I like learn this stuff, but also use it? And so started to kind of get into football, and just started trying to ask and answer interesting questions about football with some of the math stuff I learned. Talked to, friends and guys like Brian Freemow and Bill Connolly, among others that do great analytics work. And in talking with them was like, all right, I'm just not satisfied. I think I want to make my own numbers. So in conjunction with wanting to learn the statistical software R and get away from the dinosaur that is Stata that I used in all my econ classes, I just kind of started putting some of the stuff together, and really was writing about TCU specifically. My friend Jamie Plunkett and Melissa Triebwasser ran a TCU blog, and they were generous enough to let me, put all my weird ideas about football up there. And then you start to say, all right, let me preview TCU's opponents. Well, to know how good they are, I need to know how good their opponents are, and I need to know how good their opponents are. And so I just kind of built out a model, started posting, and tried to create tools that I thought were interesting about the game. And then it turned into, hey, I think I can do pretty well against some numbers. And so all of it was just kind of, I'm interested in this. I want to know things. I'm asking and answering questions that I think are relevant to me, and other people found them useful too.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that, college football is such a great sport because you have the regional aspect to it. So you can be a person that bets at just FCS, or you could be a person that just bets, Big 12 or Big 10, or you can like the sport sort of globally for how it works as a breeding ground for the NFL and NFL draft and that sort of thing. So there's a little bit of something for everybody. It's also beatable, right? It's also just more beatable, I think, than the NFL, but it takes some work. So here's an example of something like, and I want to see how you tackled this, but when I created PFF Greenline, I first started with the Massey matrix. I still started with the Keener matrix. By the way, James Keener was like this mathematical biologist in the same field as me, had randomly written a paper about pairwise comparisons in sports that I read. That was like the 2016 PFF betting picks, that we posted that year, had that model kind of as one of the cornerstones. Then I sort of transitioned into an ELO-based system where essentially with the PFF grades, what I did was I tried to reverse engineer what I thought the score of the game should have been based upon how the players graded. And I think, we talked about this on our broadcast the other day, which we're going to do more of those. We did the XFL broadcast live. You and me and some friends hung out and talked about that. But so I built this ELO system for college football, and yet my first year, I don't feel like I completely captured some of the things that mattered most in college football, which was like the differences between conferences. And so, for example, in an ELO system in the NFL, you would regress to the market if you change quarterbacks, if you change head coaches, and you would just regress to the market almost every year just because of the way things occur, right? Like at the beginning of the year, there's so much more uncertainty. As the season progresses, you lose some of that uncertainty in team strength. But I didn't even think until maybe year 2 to regress everything, not to the mean of college football, but to the mean of each conference. And then eventually I had to be even more sophisticated because there were obviously non-conference teams like Notre Dame and UConn and stuff where you would have to like regress them to a certain different type of mean. And so can you like expound upon this idea of like how hard it is to deal with the fact that if you were to make a matrix model for college football, it would fail because it would not be an invertible matrix. There's just not enough connectivity between teams over a reasonable time frame. It's just a crazy hard problem.
Yeah. Like I try to do like a simple rating system, just like a matrix of opponent rankings based on score or whatever. And you just have to like set warnings to off on your R console because it's just going to spit out and be like, matrix is not definite. Matrix is not definite because it is an incomplete matrix and you don't have full nodes of comparison. And so what really gets highlighted is history and program and coaching and talent matter a whole lot more to kind of inform some of those gaps. And what's interesting about college football is you do have just not only a diversity of like talent physically on the field. They're a team like Georgia and James Madison are not playing the same game, right? Frankly, that doesn't mean that on any given Saturday something crazy could happen and James Madison could potentially maybe pull something off. But generally, we kind of know how that's going to go, right? And so you have some of these priors that are really, really well founded. Just based on talent, based on coaching continuity, based on development cycles that can kind of inform, okay, Oregon State and, Georgia Tech are not going to play and they don't have any common opponents and there's not a lot of crossover between the Pac-12 and the ACC. How do I make an informed guess about this? And so you've got to kind of fill in the gaps. A lot of people with college football will do some really fun stuff with, arbitrary weighting or like percent of yards for opponents and all this to adjust. There's definitely some art, in that kind of adjustment for opponents and how you put all this together. And I think that the biggest thing that a lot of people don't account for is not just the diversity of talent, but like the stylistic heterogeneity. Like it's not just that teams are better than others. It's that some teams are really good at passing on offense, Tennessee, Washington. Some teams are really bad at passing defense, Oregon, Tennessee again. And that matters depending on who they can play. So you've kind of got to do this like puzzle piece thing to be, all right, so what's my prior about how good you are in the offseason? Because I've got to have a good starting point there. And then does it matter if you're better at rushing or passing? Does it matter if you're better on early downs, late downs? How does that predict? And so you've got to do a little bit more slicing and dicing, I think, necessarily than you do in the NFL to kind of create some sort of reasonable expectation. Not to mention you have to bet at 12:01 on Sunday morning if you want really an edge in college football these days. So it's definitely an interesting problem, and I've tried to go about it a couple different ways, and I think it's certainly an open question. I'm above 50% the last couple of years with just a total empirical model that doesn't account for injuries, doesn't account for weather or anything like that. Some obvious kind of low hanging fruit stuff in college football that's hard to do empirically with the data. But it's a more fun problem than the NFL to me, just because there is so much disparity. Like a lot of people will pick their games, and I think that a lot of times you need to take your lumps, and like you need to lose those MAC games on Tuesday night where nobody has any idea what the hell is going to happen. You got to put your model on those too, and take the lumps sometimes and count those in your record.
Well, I feel like It's you're so right. Like in a weird way though, I feel like the MAC is where I've done really well just because I had the empirical grades and stuff at PFF, and like I kind of figured out that puzzle. What you're talking about, which is like, think about it this way. So let's say you have a model for offense and defense and it's passing and rushing, right? And so
Yeah.
A naive model would say, okay, I take my passing EPA and again, adjust for opponent, do anything, munge that data, right? But I have my rating for offensive passing. And then I have my rating for passing defense. You take the subtraction of those, and that's your kind of like, okay, if this team passes, this is how well they're going to do against that team defensively. Same thing for running. However, in the NFL, that's going to do okay. It's not going to do perfectly because you still have to do this, what I'm going to talk about in a second, but it does okay because all the teams are pretty much homogeneous with respect to play type. There's an optimal, and even if we don't think that teams are playing perfectly optimally, they're doing okay, right? But what happens if Army plays? TCU? And now you're like, oh, Army's EPA per play passing is amazing. So like they're going to have this edge over TCU. And it's of course not going to happen because they only throw a certain amount. So you have to then multiply essentially by, you have to weigh how much this passing game matters versus that passing game. But then to your point, you also have to sort of do the second order, the I know that you know that I know type of thing. And that is a really hard problem that is in many cases, it's not more art than science because you can model it, but it certainly has some artistic components to it because it's not as easy as that. And that can lead you astray. And where it really catches me, and like I want to see your opinion of this because you talk about injuries, you talk about weather. Now, you can subscribe to a weather service. We do at Sumer. We're going to have our models sort of hooked up to that. But when it comes to like players, right, the NCAA doesn't have, like, we all know that the injury report, we're all adults here. We know that the injury report for the NFL is for gambling, right? And it's the college football has no such thing. And in fact, I think if you subscribe to a service like RotoWire or something like that, you're almost worse off if you use it in your models because it's so asymmetrically reported that if you account for injuries on one side of the ball and don't account for injuries on the other, you're going to be more wrong than if you just don't account for injuries altogether. So that really, when I think about like bowl games, for example, Parker, give me an idea of like sort of how hard that is because you almost have to throw all your fundamentals out of the window because you don't know who's playing.
Yeah, I mean, I put the numbers out there and get killed, especially the last 2 years have gotten killed on bowl games, not because my ratings are off, but just because like there's no possible way that you can account for who's going to play. Cause some of those guys don't even know until the day of. And some of that matters a whole ton. And yeah, the injury thing is really interesting because I mean, with college and these guys being so volatile, like you don't know which quarterback's girlfriend broke up with him that week. Like there's stuff going on, who had a really hard exam and wasn't focused in practice. There's stuff like that you just can't get at the individual level, obviously. And so I tend to believe that it does come out in the wash more or less. And if you're personally betting, you can, I mean, I would look at a lot of people's numbers and be like, all right, what do I think about this? And then if you have the informational edge, you could do something with that. But yeah, the non-standardized injury reports are hard because you may get into a game and not hear that a guy is hurt at all. And he only has 3 carries when he's been averaging 21. And that's an entirely different thing. Or, wide receiver drops 3 passes because he has a broken hand and he's trying to play through it. Like that's just stuff that you have to deal with in college that you just kind of got to take it on the chin there because you can't really do a lot without the standardized injury reporting. And, talking about college football and football in general as like a weak link system. I mean, you've seen teams that run mostly inside zone. They're playing a team that has a backup defensive tackle in, and they switch to all wide zone and play action. And like, they're able to focus on different strengths to target one guy. I think in college football, a lot of times you can look at like a big busted play and say, oh, this guy got hurt on the play before and went out and they went out as backup. And that's going to determine the outcome of the game. So it is a lot more volatile. I think your margins are a lot thinner just because it is so much more uncertain without knowing who's going to play when. And in terms of rushing and passing, like you do have to think about selection. If you overvalue these teams that are going for it on 3rd down and 4th down a bunch, if you overvalue that relative to early down success, you're going to predictively overestimate a team who is just getting by on getting by. and gets a big EPA boost from converting, a third and 2 into a first down or whatever. When in reality, what's going to be more predictive is how do you avoid those 3rd and 2s? How do you do on those early downs? And so it's not even just the pacing and the style of playing an Army, for instance. It's knowing when Army scrambles on first down versus when their quarterback runs on 3rd down, which one of those is going to give me more signal about how they would do on a per play basis against an average team. And it is hard. I forget who at Sumer I was laughing about with this, but we had some internal tracking metrics, and it was like all of Air Force's receivers were at the absolute top because they all have like 1 reception for 97 yards. Right. And it was like that problem exactly there is you do have to adjust for kind of the total volume and the consistency and the situational aspect of it, in addition to almost a blind, throwing blind darts for who's going to play what given weekend.
Yeah, for sure. And we're going to talk about some of those like cornerstone metrics that you developed in a second here. But first, I do want to talk. We want to thank you for joining the SumerSports show today. By the way, you can subscribe to us, rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. We'd love to get you to be a part of our YouTube community as well. SumerSports.com for sort of all of your favorite analytical content. We took a little bit of a break after the draft, but we will be back to producing some really good content pretty soon here after the draft. We also have a couple sponsors that will be joining us basically either next week or the week after. And we're really excited about that, people joining the Sumer family. Let's go ahead and show. Now, this is an example, Parker. This is sort of, I think, where a lot of people sort of, when we started posting game predictions at Sumer, people are like, wait a sec, this is Parker stuff. And we're like, yeah, it is Parker stuff because he created it. This is
shout out to a lot of my friends who got in Sumer's mentions like, hey, did you guys just copy this? And had to say, no, this is me. I did this. I posted this willingly.
Yeah, for sure. So this is an example. And look, like, the market had the spread 13. You had it somewhere closer to 11. Like, that's not actually like, one of the things in gambling to realize is like, know the value of a point. Like 13 is probably, 13, 12, and 11 are not worth that much in college football. So just know that. And a lot of people would have liked the under in that game. That's not really where I want to go. I kind of want to go to, Parker, if we look, let's say at TCU for right now, like if we go down the column on TCU, you go ahead and explain sort of the metrics that you're using. Because to me, I think when somebody's trying to build a model, they sort of have to get the right features. And to me, this has a lot of the right features.
Yeah. And again, this is the whole goal of this is to be a one sheet. So you can look at the matchup and say, what do I need to know? What do I need to look for on the field to understand how this game's going to happen? I used to post these like back in 2019, 2020 without a score prediction or a win probability. And people were just, every week clamoring for it. So it's like, all right, I'll give the people what they want and throw that. But I do think that the projected points and the win probability are tertiary concerns to me on this. So the way that we start is kind of like, this is like a walkthrough of how I think about a game. And so we start on that left column right underneath TCU. You have your EPA margin. So again, per play efficiency, how much value on net are you adding? Offense versus defense. It's weighted slightly more towards offense, just again to kind of calibrate the predictive power. And so you see the raw offensive and then the rank there next to it. Same with defensive in the rank. So TCU 0.129 is 17th in the nation, and negative 0.006 is 50th in the nation. Darker blue is better. Darker red is worse. And so we start with just basic efficiency. That's a good overview, kind of a team strength, right? Georgia's 2, TCU's 19. Sounds about right. And then I break it down into success rates, which are just binary indicators of how well you did. Because again, I think efficiency and explosiveness matter most in college football, but like both of those happen. There are teams who are not very efficient, who are very explosive. TCU, great example. They're 83rd in a passing success rate, but if you look in the middle, they're 30th in EPA per pass. So it's like, yeah, we're going to miss, three out of 4 or 2 out of 3 passes, but when we hit that one, it's going to pop off. And so that's really informative as to what I'm expecting to see versus a defense. Cause then I can look over here and see Georgia, they're number 1 in passing success rate, and they're 33rd in EPA per pass on defense, or 36th. And so it's like, can TCU, generate any consistency? So do that for defense as well. And then points per drive. I think the pace, argument in college football is so important. So putting things in like per drive, per possession really matters. This gives you a good barometer of team strength. Also matches up really nicely with EPA margin raw. And all of these are unadjusted for opponents here. They get adjusted in the model, but unadjusted here. And then net field position, again, something I think that matters a lot more in college football than it does in the NFL, because there's so much more volatility with special teams and turnovers.
The units? Can you tell me the unit? Is that yards? So they're 3.4 yards better than the average team? Okay.
No, they're 3.4 yards better at average starting field position than they are allowing. So if you look in the middle here, I've got field position. They're starting on average at their own 30.9, which is 33rd in the nation. But they are allowing opponents to start at their own 27.5, which is 17th in the nation. So that's gotcha. Okay. That's kind of the net. Where do we expect drives to start?
Gotcha. And those are in those middle tables right there that you can extract that from, the 30.9 and the 27.5. So that says a lot about kind of, I think about that, for the pro football, people, that reminds me of like the Alex Smith, Andy Reid years, where like they were always a yard, they were getting yards here and yards there. And you wonder, why are they winning all these games? It's like, well, they're kicking ass in special teams and not turning the ball over. And that's, sort of the outcome.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and in college football, it's funny too, because like you'll see like Iowa and Northwestern and Iowa State will be awesome at starting field position, but then terrible at points per drive. And that actually tells me a lot more about their offense than it does, whereas like a lot of teams, Baylor in 2021 was a good example. Like something like 30% of Baylor's drives started in opponent territory, and almost 50% of their scoring drives started in opponent territory. And it's like, okay, if you get the ball at your opponent's 30 and you kick a field goal, that does nothing for your offensive efficiency for me, right? Like you were given a field goal based on a turnover. So we have to account for some of that, because if you don't, then what you start doing is you start overestimating the quality of an offense like Iowa's. And that's not something you want to do typically. So that matters a whole lot. The other two that I think are really important, because the rest of these just kind of break it down according to key features, but is this rush rate over expected, again, a measure of style. So down distance, yard line, and score difference, how much more do you rush than the average team? In college football, that's going to tell me a lot about pace mostly. And it'll help me kind of magnify differences. So TCU rushes a little bit more than average. This isn't a great example of it, but let's see. Oh, here's a good example. So if you look at the other side, Georgia is minus 1% rush rate over expected. They're rushing or passing more often. And then you look at TCU's passing defense is 60th relative to their rushing defense being 42nd in EPA per play. So that rush rate over expected helps me like magnify or amplify how big of a deal it's going to be that you're bad at pass defense. And so because Georgia passes more, TCU's deficiency in the pass defense is going to matter a whole lot more, as we saw on the field there. Lastly, kind of a silly stat I made up, the Eckel ratio. Got really annoyed by people posting about time of possession, because I think time of possession is dull and unwieldy. And so this is just the ratio of quality possessions, also known as drives on which it's more likely you score than you don't, which correlates about to like having a first down at the 37.5. And the opponent 37.5. So you just get a 1 or a 0 there. And the ratio is how much of those drives in the game did you control? It's directly stolen from the Corsi metric in hockey.
Interesting.
Which is,
So basically, how often do you get in field goal range ish? And then the ratio is how many such drives were yours in the game?
My quality possessions over total quality possessions in the game. Yep.
Okay.
And so TCU, 56.1% of all quality possessions in a game were theirs. And generally, because like finishing drives is kind of noisy and can talk about like your red zone, like a lot of offenses are good at moving the ball, but not good at finishing in the red zone. Because football is a game of opportunity, and especially college football, this gives us a little bit more of an idea of like a game control than a time of possession. Because it just says like how often are you getting opportunities to score relative to how much you're letting them up. And if you see in kind of the offense versus defense tab, I break that up into points per quality possession, points per Eckel, and a rate, how often you do it on each side of the ball. That gives us a little bit more information as well. Again, just kind of a game control and really helps to say, are you controlling the opportunities, which is going to correlate with success more than, potentially overweighting the value of one play where you score at the end of a drive?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, I was watching my daughters play soccer yesterday, and it was like, I look over my wife, I'm like, they've been on our side of the field the entire game. And like, that's kind of what this is showing, right? Like, where you're kind of the possessions, you're the only ones getting there. And then, yeah, to the middle table, it's what do you do with those possessions? Georgia there, basically getting 5 points per every possession they get to the 35 or so, and that that's substantial. You're scoring quite a bit on those drives, and you're not turning it over in the red zone either or missing field goals, which is an important part of it. And when other teams get into that side of the field, they only allow 3.11 points, which, to your point, like, this is cool in that also because I think for most of these, I if I remember correctly, you do ranks by conferences when it's a conference game, right?
No, not here. These are all national.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, yeah. Like, I think obviously, if it was two like SEC teams, what would be cool is like obviously having the SEC rank, which will be, but for a non-conference game, obviously you have like all 131 teams in FBS, which sort of shows it's tough to be first or second when you're looking at, you're playing like Coastal has like the easiest schedule in college football and they're able to dominate. Georgia has to play through the SEC, and being second, for example, in EPA per rush allowed in college football, and second in EPA per pass in all of college football is incredibly impressive, I would say. So this is really cool. Hopefully, we'll be seeing more of this on the Sumer channels and things like that. But I feel like this is, for all of the aspiring modelers out there, aspiring analysts, like, it's all about having, you took something from hockey. It's about having curiosity. It's about having a fertile mind and that kind of thing. And that's really the only way to win, because look, like, the betting markets are an amalgamation of all the things we all know and an average over it. So in order to beat them, you're going to actually need to have some innovation and to think about things a little bit differently than everybody else and be right. Those are the two prerequisites to beating large markets, Parker. So very cool there. When it comes to player evaluation and player valuation, tell me a little bit about your experience and kind of where you see the future going in college football, because it's going to be important now, right? When we think about NIL, we think about the transfer portal. We're literally, we were at that conference in Columbus at Ohio State, and we're literally, having NIL people come up to us and ask us for our, because it used to be in the NFL, you valued players in the free agency market, and like that's how you came up with expected contracts and all of that kind of stuff. But now you have to value players in college football because Jordan Addison is worth a certain amount, and it might not be necessarily an efficient market yet, but I bet you it's directionally correct.
Yeah, it is hard because like there is a salary cap, but it's different for every team and we don't know what it is. And so that matters a whole lot in terms of trying to like optimize based on NIL. But yeah, I think player evaluation is really interesting because you get a lot of like the recruiting services, and there's people who are really smart doing work there, but they are trying to evaluate talent, and then they're talking about it in terms of like NFL draft picks. And so like, we predicted this guy to be a 5-star. Somebody else had a 4-star. He went in the first round. Our prediction's better. That makes sense. And I don't think that's necessarily like wrong. It's not bad that they identified draft picks, but there is kind of like a college good category that isn't necessarily in the NFL framework, where like I can look at a guy and think, dude, you're very fun in college. You do not have an NFL career, and that's okay. That's not what this is about necessarily. So evaluating them and evaluating fit, I think, is really, really important and not well understood. One, because player level data basically publicly only exists impartially for quarterbacks. If you want to do any kind of like play-to-play advanced modeling, and you can use stuff like ESPN's QBR, which is out there that could potentially help you get an idea of that. But for individual players, it's really, really hard to get the right data to evaluate them. And then most of the stats that people are using right now to evaluate players are not, they're counting stats. They're not really accounting for like a plus minus situation or an on-off situation. They are descriptive, I think is the best way to say that, not necessarily predictive. So predictive player modeling in the in the NCAA basically only really exists with the fantasy guys who are like this subculture of Twitter who grind extremely hard and do some crazy stuff with data and without data. But yeah, so I think that's interesting. And then tying it to NIL, it's almost different than the team, right? Because like we haven't seen the first round of NIL busts, right? We're just getting to some guys who took a lot of money and didn't pan out. And what are boosters going to do with that, right? Like, what is Buddy Garrity going to do when this guy doesn't throw a pass his entire career and I've given him $4 million, right? So that is another kind of dimension to it. But we don't really know what's out there, and there are bad numbers reported about NIL. And if you miss on NIL, your team doesn't really get hurt in the same way that an NFL team does, where if you sign this guy and he's a bust, well, now you can't devote any other resources anywhere else. So like, it's almost like the stakes for NIL are so low that to think of it in a salary cap sense is kind of hard. It's more so like an unconstrained optimization, because these college football teams are just finding the funds. And so you're saying this guy's a good transfer portal target, just go get him. I don't care what it takes. Go get him. And so that's a little bit hard with like the player evaluation and putting NIL in there. Although when you're looking at the transfer portal, I think it's probably more important to look at what the teams have historically been able to reportedly do than what, a guy might be worth, because sometimes it is just go get your guy and pay him whatever he needs.
Yeah, it's very baseball-like in that way, right? Or, I mean, even English Premier League, like where, to your point, it's an unconstrained optimization, and you're really trying to whittle down, how much somebody else will pay for the player. But what you don't want is necessarily like a booster to come over and give a guy a few $1 million, him not to pan out because of your system, and then for that booster to never want, a piece of the action again. Yeah. That can really be a tricky thing. Like, to your point about, player eval, like when I was at Pro Football Focus, like we had our player grades that went back to 2014. They actually, one weekend I was like in a very sicko mood, and I looked at our grades from 2020 and 2021 at FCS as well. And basically, like I never understood, like I could never get to this idea of what a replacement player was for college football. Like I didn't know for like Alabama, what does a replacement player look like? Like I have no idea. But like, so I always did like a wins above an average FBS player was kind of my my thing. And so, I would go through and I'd say, okay, on a play level, what kind of grade did I expect in this situation, given this opponent, given this surrounding cast? And then I would sort of, go above and beyond that. And ultimately, like most of Alabama's players were above zero. Most of La Tech's players were below zero. And it gave me a decent idea of who was going to get drafted where. Like I'll post to the article here. I don't necessarily want to get PFF to click, but like, it did a pretty good job of sort of stacking players, and it's still used a lot by PFF's clients in the college football space, but it's not publicly available, right? You have to pay a subscription to get PFF's grades. And so, and it's also like PFF's grades are not like that easily pull downable from the website. So it's a little bit tricky, but I did find, there was some success there. But the thing I want to end on, because we only have about 10 minutes left, is the thing you alluded to, which is fantasy football. I have a little bit of history in fantasy. My former betting partner, who's a data scientist at PFF, Ben Brown, he and I have won the Millie Maker in college football once. We do that fairly frequently. In fact, this is the only year in the last like 5 I didn't play college DFS, because at Sumer we have some restrictions there. I feel like college DFS, college fantasy is so ripe. And I firstly, Parker, I want to ask you, how big could this market be from a consumer standpoint? Like, how many people could you get involved in this? And from a DFS standpoint, so think about like season long and all that stuff. Like, how big could the market be? And how, and then DFS, because DFS is going to be rife with all the problems that you don't necessarily have in the NFL, which is like, I'm starting a guy in the flex, he doesn't play because he just didn't show up that day and no one reported it ever. Or like, I call it the Trey Sermon problem. Like Trey Sermon, when he was on Oklahoma, like just dead ass would just not play some games. And like, was it Ramondre Stevenson that took a spot? Like, he would just like, and then he shows up for Ohio State, rushes for 200 yards in the semifinal game. And I'm like, fuck, like he was good this whole time. And all this stuff. And so it has those problems that don't exist in the NFL. And so obviously for mathematicians like us, we're like, those are fun. That makes it a good game, right? It's not efficient. That means we can poke holes in it. But it also, from a marketing standpoint, might leave out people who would provide some of the hold for us in terms of players. So how can you sort of think about that one?
Yeah, right now I think there's two things that are kind of like it's certainly for sickos right now. And it's transitioning into more people playing, but I think access is an issue right now because like the books just can't keep up with like what are the odds for a player prop for every MAC receiver or something. Like there's just too much right now, I think, for not enough demand. And so it is still kind of like college fantasy football is still kind of a sicko thing. I also think because like I don't believe you can like play it on ESPN, right? Like it's limited in where they have access because I know that they like have partners with teams and there's potentially limitations.
Yeah, I was in Thor Nystrom's league like a couple of years ago. You were probably in that same league, and back before we were friends, and like it was in like some really weird was it like Fantasy Pro? I can't remember what platform it was on, but it was in this weird and to be honest with you, man, I had a hard time I'm not very good in season long I'd be the worst. I'm a bad person in season long leagues because I'm like doing pregame shows and all this kind of stuff. And so
I get bored too. I forget.
Yeah, I get bored and I forget to set my lineup. But like DFS, the crazy part about DFS, and again, this gets to the problem is like when I was living in Ohio, college DFS was not legal in Ohio or Indiana because amateur something about that, right? All DFS was legal in both those states, Indiana and except for on the college level. Sports betting was legal in Indiana, but college DFS wasn't. In Kentucky, sports betting was illegal, but college DFS was legal. So you can imagine my Saturday mornings of trying to get lineups down and then also trying to sports bet legally. It was a grind. I don't foresee that getting weakened anytime soon because college sports have kind of fallen by the wayside. Fantasy sports have kind of fallen by the wayside relative to sports betting, but it does sort of underscore what you're saying about the sort of sicko-ness of what college football DFS represents. But and it does again depend on state. So like Ohio and Indiana, very, very fertile markets in the prop space. Places like Iowa, stuff like that, not so much. Prop betting is where I see like a future in terms of like if you're not maybe necessarily wanting to put together an optimizer for college DFS, but you want to bet under interceptions on Tanner Mordecai or something like that, you can bet that. I do see a possibility as far as expansion at player level modeling to player props.
I think that's totally right. I mean, one, I'll say I'm worried about what this whole Iowa State betting thing is going to do just to knee jerk as regulators see that players broke rules and what they're going to try to do because of the amateurism kind of tide that hangs over it. So I'm a little worried about it from that standpoint. And I will say like for the season long stuff, again, some guys I respect are not doing any kind of optimization. They're doing, here's a bunch of average draft position lists that other people are making. And I'm going to say, is this guy over or undervalued? And then they optimize based on that by hand. Like these guys are just doing a ton of grinding, a ton of opportunity kind of research like that. As for props, I think that's interesting. That's probably again with the like the heterogeneity of style, that's potentially really, really exploitable because it's really, really hard to do. But it is also subject to, hey, I had, X amount on this guy and he's in a boot 13 minutes before the game and I can't do anything about that. So like that kind of uncertainty, I think is significant enough that it's going to be really hard to see how they can do that consistently. But player props, I think right now, the people that are doing them well that I follow publicly are doing a lot of, well, team X allows this % of yardage, team Y gains this % of yardage. So I'm going to go over on this guy and that kind of stuff. So I think it could be more rigorous and empirical with, and again, the issue is data, right? Some of these guys I know are like copy and pasting from Sports Reference and putting in Excel and all this stuff. It's hard, man. So I think there's plenty of opportunities as data maybe gets more accessible. I don't know if it's going to, but that's the big issue right now is like really hard to do an empirical player prop market, just because publicly you got to shell out if you want data for that. And it's pretty hard to do.
Well, and the thing about, so yeah, what Ben and I used to do, was like, what was really nice about the college DFS market, it was they have what are called slates, right? So, as anybody who knows, anybody who's sweated out 60 games on a Saturday because their product was on the line or whatever knows, like, there's 60 games on a weekend, or on a weekday on Saturday, but the DFS market only contains about 10 of those games. And so when you're looking at all the manual things that need to go in, no human is going to be able to manually adjust 60 teams worth of shares and injury grinding on. But like in a 10 or 12 game DFS lineup, you can't. I mean, it's possible. It's the same thing you do in the NFL. And so you can do that, but then that don't, like, from that kind of modeling, because, let's face it, like, prop modeling and fantasy modeling are the same thing, except for one has a more granular distribution than the other, right? If you're going to bet over 17.5 yards, you need to know, basically like the probability mass surrounding 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 21 yards, and then, determine whether or not the price is worth betting. Like that requires you to have a projection for that distribution, which is the same process that you'd have in modeling fantasy. And so it restricts your market, to your point. And yeah, it's a hard problem, but because of that, I think they're beatable with the right data and the right analysis tools. It just, and there are small little markets. Like I wrote an article on PFF a couple of years ago about if you just use turnover worthy plays, and it's sort of the same exact thing as like if you're betting soccer and you use expected goals and goal differential, you can sort of build a curve that does better than either one individually. If you go to PFF and use turnover worthy plays as well as interceptions and kind of build a regression and then like a negative binomial and all that kind of stuff, you can beat interception markets. Now, your book's going to, if that's the only thing you're betting and you're constantly like just pounding them on interception props, you might have a problem with being limited and stuff. But at least if you want to take a little bit of money at the very beginning, you can do that kind of thing. So I think what's really cool and like why I want to do this podcast with you is like there's so many opportunities, and I think at SumerSports we're sort of continuing to build a public face. We're kind of like easing ourselves into gaming and fantasy and stuff. I wanted to talk about this because I think that in the NFL it's more for fun, and you can still grind out an edge. I think in college football there's real opportunity to sort of have an edge and to exploit it.
Yeah, absolutely. And with like the relative, I mean, you start thinking about, okay, if I get really dialed in on player props, one, that helps college coaches game plan, right? Like, hey, I project this guy's going to go over against you. Why do we think he's going to have better performance? You can start to do that. That could be useful in a non-gambling sense. And with stuff like transfer portal and kind of the volatility of year to year, I think dialing in really, really good player projections is potentially like a super good and useful like team level kind of diagnostic that again, all these college coaches are smart guys, even if they're not mathematically inclined, want an edge. I think that's what's really exciting about college football is like, if you get good enough at some of this stuff, you could start doing some really good, really interesting team preview breakdown kind of stuff that could be really useful for game planning as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's, to your point, there's so much opportunity. And I also think this, like, you are a teacher. You have your PhD, by the way. We congratulated you on air a couple of weeks ago, but I'd like to congratulate you again. Welcome to the Illuminati of PhDs, as it were. We've taught before, and there's a lot of like educational research suggesting that if you have skin, if you gamify learning, you put skin in the game for learners, they learn the game better. And I feel like my journey, because I'm different than you, like I loved NFL football. Like, we chopped it up at the office. Like, I know a lot about NFL. I was never really like, I watched Vince Young against USC in 2005. Like I've watched Adrian Peterson against Boise. I remember that, that upset and all that stuff. But like from like a nuts and bolts of like college football, like I didn't watch a ton of it. I played in college and like So I the only college football I watched was Timmy Chang in the midnight game, because that's when I would wake up from my nap. And so, but like putting a gambling and fantasy spin on it has helped me learn the college game and helped me enjoy it so much more than if I just was an observer and stuff. And so, I think that it has that added benefit of, learning the sport better because you have some skin in the game. And I don't think that can be underscored.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things I tell people that like want to get started. I get, especially this time of year, I get 10 to 15 messages a week about like, hey, I'm an undergrad, I'm a statistics major, I'm just starting. I want to do this. What do I do? And the answer is like, one, ask a question about something weird in college football, go practice the data skills to like answer it, but also create a model, like put pen to paper and create something. And even if it's bad, that gives you a starting point to like iterate and learn. And that's kind of the process of learning, is you can create a record and say, oh, I projected this and I went 30% against the spread. Well, shoot, what can I do to improve this? And that kind of gives you a tangible way to learn and also, understand the game better, which is a lot of fun.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, this has been a lot of fun. We really do appreciate you all coming. Our Dean, one of our very loyal listeners, thanks for the content. Great show. We really appreciate you. Actually, there's a question here from OA. When is the O'Reilly Football Analytics book scheduled to come out? Well, my book is coming out in September, October. So, but you can pre-order it on Amazon or Target. Anywhere you find your books. I was surprised to see it on Target. That's the only reason I ever say it there. Maybe one day.
I'm really dumb because I just Googled O'Reilly Football Analytics book because I didn't put together that O'Reilly was the publisher. I was like, is that some analytics guy? I don't know who that is. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the book, that the Football Analytics with R and Python, that my colleague Richard Eric, or my former colleague when I was a mathematical biologist, Richard Erickson, and I are writing. I actually we're basically finished up with it, sending it to the publisher this month. So I'm kind of excited about that. I started it when I was at PFF, and I was a little bit more bored than I am now. And so now that we have all this these great things to work on at Sumer, I certainly don't have enough. I wouldn't have agreed to write it had I been at Sumer. But when I was at PFF, I was a little bored. No disrespect to them, but that's why I decided to do it then. And I was too far in by the time I joined Sumer, so I kept going with it on nights and weekends. So, but anyway, we really appreciate you all coming. I really, this podcast, I know Thomas is out this week, so you're going to get Parker and you're going to get Adam Vonderhaar, who is a past award winner in the Big Data Bowl, formerly of the Dallas Cowboys, currently of SumerSports. He and Parker are going to talk about what working for a team is like. That's going to be Wednesday. What I love about this show is all the stuff you get on this podcast is stuff you can't get on another podcast, including this discussion that we just had, which is a lot of fun. I really appreciate you, Parker, for filling in for Thomas, and we got to talk about something me and Thomas would never talk about. So I'm happy about that. So as I said before, really appreciate you for coming. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you find your podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. Follow us on YouTube, subscribe, hit the like button. All those things help our show grow. Tell a friend about your show, because about this show, I was there first. I was one of the initial SumerSports show fans. So for Parker Fleming, this has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 55 of the SumerSports show.